Hey everybody, welcome back to Spacedock. I'm Hojuana and wow, you all really had a lot to say about the Gunstar video last month. Your comments were really interesting to read through, so today we're continuing the discussion about starfighters. To start with, a lot of you mentioned that the Gunstar was more like a gunship rather than a fighter, but that was kind of the whole point. In my opinion, a helicopter-like vehicle might be better suited to that style of space combat compared to the regular single-seat fighter that is oh so very common in sci-fi. Babylon 5 and Battlestar Galactica do have a different style of combat to what the last starfighter presents, so yes, there's going to be some flaws in comparisons. That said, the Gunstar style isn't necessarily the best option for the audience, as it is just different enough from what everyone expects out of fighter combat that people often try to assign the craft to some other role. I feel like this is largely in part to Star Wars, though there are tons of other franchises that do the same thing. Fighter combat is based on World War II, so what we end up with is an expectation of single-seat fighters, typically armed only with guns. Sometimes heavy fighters show up, like the ARC 170, as well as the much larger multi-crew bomber sort of style of things, like the Millennium Falcon. Now there's nothing wrong with these expectations, or indeed with sci-fi that takes from World War II. As I said at the end of the Submarines in Space video, grounding fiction by basing it on real life helps an audience to understand and connect with exactly what's going on. The problem is that World War II air combat tropes have become so incredibly ingrained in what most people think space fighters are going to be like, that when presented with a more realistic take on space combat, it just doesn't compute for them. The same thing also happens when the analogy gets taken a bit too far, and we end up with the confusion over the bombers at the start of Star Wars The Last Jedi. The elephant in the room here is that fighters are almost certainly never going to be actually used in space, as the physics of Newtonian movement don't really allow for that style of combat whatsoever. That doesn't mean to say you can't add them to your setting if you so desire, but you'd need to include some justification to make them viable. The problem is, the distances involved are pretty vast, with some very high velocity weapons fire traded between spacecraft. The typical comparison is naval battles, big ships shooting big shells at each other with some other things going on around them. Carriers and aircraft have played a huge role in naval doctrine since World War II, but aircraft don't really have an analogous element up in space. What I mean by that is that naval combat takes place across three domains: on top of the water surface, below the water surface, and up in the air above the water surface. There are separate craft for each of these domains, supporting each other's strengths and weaknesses, with some crossover between a fourth domain that is land. Space has no such separate areas. The analogy here would be that everything is on the surface of the water, with crossover with celestial bodies taking the place of land. There's no underwater environment to hide in, and there's nowhere above to fly up into. In this sort of setting, we can see why fighters make much less sense. We don't see tiny little ships zooming around dogfighting on the surface, or at least we don't anymore. Back in the 19th century, warships were turning into metal-plated beasts with huge, slow-to-turn guns that dealt devastating damage. The trade-off here was that they were expensive to produce, and had a bit of a vulnerability to smaller, fast ships that their big, slow guns couldn't track. Stick some torpedoes on these small, cheap boats, and you could overwhelm a battleship entirely. So how do you protect your battleships from the enemy's torpedo boats? You stick guns on your torpedo boats and set them loose to destroy their torpedo boats. Sort of a torpedo boat destroyer. Eventually, these destroyers overtook torpedo boats entirely, as they weren't limited to close-to-shore operations, and then the designation lost the torpedo boat part, and then continued to lose meaning over the decades as they got bigger. We do still have smaller ships in use today, but they're often more like anti-ship missile carriers or shore patrol craft and are vulnerable to aircraft. So what's my point here? If space is a single domain where every vehicle has the same movement opportunities, then we can take inspiration not from a different domain to naval vessels, but the same one. We can take the idea of a small, multi-crew vessel with turrets and apply it to spacefighter combat, and well, we kinda get the Gunstar. A turreted ship can move and shoot in different directions, which is what we see the Gunstar doing, and even the first bit of real combat in the movie is against another turreted spacecraft. It's a little boat chase as Alex works up the nerve to even engage in combat, and when he does, he's met by all these spaceboat fighters outside. Wait a sec, what are all these guys doing with their engines burning while not moving? That doesn't seem right. Anyway, this is the point where everyone rushes to the comments to tell me about the Defiant again. No, not that one, but I do want to talk about that in a minute. I mean the Bolton Pole Defiant, a two-seater British interceptor aircraft with only a turret for its armament. On the face of it, this seems like a solid comparison to make, but I think it's a bit flawed as, once again, something from World War II has become a touchstone for spacefighter combat. These aircraft couldn't spin around on the spot and fly backwards or sideways like a Star Fury, so why does a Gunstar get negatively compared to the Defiant? It wasn't even meant to shoot fighters. It was designed to fly up below bombers to take them out, something it was fairly okay at. The Star Trek Defiant, no, the other Star Trek Defiant, I also want to talk about, as that thing was very clearly inspired by fighter combat. Its main armament was forward-fixed slow projectiles that do a ton of damage, and it flies around very nimbly. All this is in spite of it being longer than a 40-story building is tall. This is why the craft often had weird scale issues, as it's actually pretty damn big, but because it was meant to fly around like a little zoomy aircraft, it often ended up being scaled down to fit when compared to ships around it. It does look pretty sweet though, especially this shot here. Like, come on, it's so cool. Almost as cool as you'll be after liking this video. But I'm getting off track here. We're supposed to be talking about fighters, not big ships pretending to be fighters. A lot of you rightfully pointed out that there are two-seater fighters, and sure, that's correct, but the Gunstar specifically is way more like an Apache than a Tomcat. The seating layout and cockpit is the same as a chopper, with the pilot at the back and the gunner in the front, with the staggered joint canopy of a Hind or Tiger. The armament is similar too, as both have an underslung turret below the nose which moves with the gunner. Even the side-mounted missile/rocket pods match up. Sort of. I think the layout is pretty neat, though there are more standard two-seater space fighters zooming around as well, like Stargate's F-302, though the second seat was only really a support role and the 302 could be flown solo. Interestingly, it started out as a purely missile-based craft, actually managing to subvert the World War II trope, and stayed that way for multiple seasons until they were upgraded with railguns and it went right back to being gun-based dogfighting. At least they retained their missiles though, so it wasn't a complete regression in combat style. Arguably, it had a much more Cold War jet fighter vibe going on, which is neat and leads me nicely to the final point a lot of you mentioned, using a high-low mix of both the Gunstar and Star Fury. A high-low mix means you have a combination of more expensive but more capable jet fighters, the high, as well as less expensive but less capable fighters, the low. Applying this concept to our Gunstar Furies is a cool idea. It is difficult to directly compare across franchises, but the Gunstar is definitely more complicated and physically larger, so it's likely to be more expensive, both to produce and to fly. Back up a Gunstar with multiple Star Furies and you got yourself a fun little mixture of fighters with different capabilities. So I hope you all understand why I feel the Gunstar is the better craft now, but really that's only because it doesn't rely on what I think is the overused source of inspiration that is World War II. Again, there's nothing wrong with using that as inspiration, but if you're making something yourself, maybe think a little outside the box and use something else as the foundation.